Well, hi everybody, Father Alex here, host of the Godcast and also the Vicar of St Matthew's Church in Burnley. I'm also the author of Our Daily Bread from August to the Altar, a Priest Story, which is available in all good bookshops and online. Do check that out. I'm delighted to say that my guest today on the Godcast is Michael J. Leyden. Michael is the Dean of Emmanuel Theological College. He's also involved as an honorary canon at Chester Cathedral, and we're going to be talking theological education, a bit about himself, and a bit about the future. So I do hope you enjoy this interview, and if you do, then please do subscribe to the Godcast YouTube page or follow me on X at AlexDJFrost. But for now, enjoy this interview with Michael J. Leyden. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Michael J. Leyden. Michael is the Dean of Emmanuel Theological College. Michael, it's great to get you on. How are you?
I'm all right, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to being here. It's great.
Great, thank you. Now, for people who aren't aware of you and I, let's just give this a little bit of context. You're an ordained priest in the Church of England, is that correct?
I am, yes. Sorry, no collar today, but yes, I am a priest. I was ordained in Liverpool Diocese, getting on for 15 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. What did you do prior to ordination, Michael?
I taught quite a bit. I'd various jobs in some part-time roles in higher education, mostly. I was finishing a PhD, things like that. So, I was discerning, um, really from my teens, but at university, I thought I'd gone to university to escape God and vocation. And I'd been there a few weeks, and one of the kind of chaplains said, "Do you think you might be called to be ordained?" I thought, "Oh, flipping heck. I'm supposed to be getting away from that." I, we were saying more in a bit, I guess, but yeah, I don't come from a kind of family of people that went to university. So that was all a big wide world. And I thought, you go away from home and live your life and escape a bit of the kind of the growing up things like vocation. But actually, in a nice way, it followed me around a bit. So I taught, and I thought that was going to be my career, but with this kind of lingering question of should I be ordained and what kind of priest? Self-supporting, keep a proper job, as it were, and do this on the side to be helpful, or a parish priest or chaplain or what. That was the kind of I spent a bit of my twenties trying to figure that out.
And did you serve your curacy locally? Where were you?
Yeah, I was in the Diocese of Liverpool. Yeah, so I was ordained and served on the edge of the diocese, or at least no, on the edge of the city. So, place called Rainhill, which was closer to St Helens, really. So Pilkington Glass, big kind of industrial town in Liverpool Diocese, but not kind of in the city of Liverpool. And then I was a vicar down near Crewe in Chester Diocese as well. So I've mostly been on the edge of big post-industrial towns, which is kind of where I grew up. I grew up on a council estate on the edge of Liverpool, so it's places that I understand and know, and kind of like being in those sorts of contexts.
Yeah. Did you feel once you became a vicar that that would be have a limited life? Did you always intend to return to theological education? How did it come around?
No, I did not. I loved being a vicar, and my wife is ordained. She's a vicar, and I kind of love watching, being a little bit involved in stuff, but I really loved it. I love being with people. I love the kind of sense of the ups and downs of life, being in a community, embedded in a community, being for the community. Certainly, one of my parishes was a kind of context where a lot of statutory organisations were withdrawing their efforts because post-industrial urban contexts, lots of deprivation, lots of need, lots of challenge, not much resource. And I love the fact that the church has been committed to being local, to being on estates, to being in urban contexts, in industrial contexts, and being for people. And I loved it. I loved all the mess of that. So I really missed it. It was a kind of clear sense of vocation to be back in theological education. But even for I've been doing this, been involved in training and forming ministers now for the last 12 years. But even only until 2018, I was doing that on a part-time basis and kept a part-time incumbency because I did think, my wife used to say to me, they carry you out of a parish in a box. So it was vocation really, and partly because when I left teaching, I thought I was leaving teaching behind when I went into curacy. I wasn't um, chuffed about it, to be honest. I enjoyed working with people, particularly liked working in higher education with people who felt they shouldn't be there, couldn't be there. And there's a bit of a theme that we'll probably come back to in this conversation. And it felt like I was putting that one thing down to go and be with people in a different way. And actually, somewhere on the line, God sort of brought the two together, which is the miracle of vocation, isn't it? You know, the way I've heard you talk before about the skills that you bring into ministry from a former career, and the way God uses those. And the church doesn't always appreciate them, but God certainly is able to use them in the context you serve in. I think that's been a bit of my story too. So accidentally involved in theological education to start with, and then over time, it's become what I do. And it's a different way of serving the local church, actually, is to equip good priests, good lay ministers, good deacons.
And maybe outside of your own context, Michael, Emmanuel, have you been content with the pace of how the wider church has picked up on this thing? Well, you're laughing, some maybe not, but from rather than we look at the inside, Emmanuel, let's look at the outside first of
Yeah.
all. What do you see when you look outside of your own context?
It's really tricky, this, isn't it? Because there are probably two or three versions of the Church of England. Obviously, we're having this conversation in the context of a huge national conversation around trustworthiness, around processes and structures of accountability, um, uh, serious accusations of abuse and potential abuse. And then there's also the kind of grassroots church. And I'm not saying they're completely different and they're opposed to each other, but I think if you've been in grassroots frontline ministry, it does feel different sometimes to look up at the institution and think, what? What's going on here? Uh, what's this thing that I'm part of? And some of that that happens with all organizations, sort of sense of detachment that you sometimes feel from the kind of public representatives or uh, the people in charge. So there's a bit of that, I guess, that forming priests for the church for me, it's very much been in the context of the Northwest, which is where I'm from. I love it. I really believe revival's coming from the Northwest. I think, the church in lots and lots of ways is very healthy because, like yourself, there are loads of priests who are just embedded in communities and are for the people. I think one of the challenges I spot is we're often for the people. We're not always of the people, if that makes sense. So we serve often in context and communities, particularly. So I said earlier, I grew up on a council estate in Liverpool. First person in my family to go to university, only person in my family to go to university. We were the kind of working class where if you didn't have a job, you're on the dole. They were your options. There was no savings. There was no family to bail you out. I know there's a bit of a debate now about what working class means, but I grew up in the 80s and the 90s in Liverpool and in Knowsley, which some of you will know and some of your viewers will know was kind of notorious for deprivation, particularly in the 80s and 90s and nationally. And it was you worked or you were on the dole. They were your options. You don't meet many clergy for whom that's their story. So we're definitely for the people. I think the pace of change in which we're of the people is catching up, but it's been a long time coming. Because we've sometimes given the impression that God isn't really calling people from those sorts of backgrounds with that sort of story. That's my story. Those sorts of backgrounds and those sorts of stories. You don't meet many people where you touch base on that sort of level, I
Yeah,
think.
that is absolute music to my ears, Michael, because in my address for my private members motion, I actually say,
Yes.
we are meant to be the Church of England, not the church in it, and I
Yeah.
do suggest we are at times very much the church in it and not
Yeah.
of it, and that very much relates to what you're saying. And
Yeah.
when I've been doing my research for this private members bill, Michael, it's clear that there is some good stuff going on. I've had
Yeah.
people in the south of England who've taught me about pilot apprenticeship schemes. Um, and I've spoken to Dr. Reverend Chris Rogers, who's done a really good piece around
Yeah.
urban theology, which I found fascinating. And of course, Emmanuel, well, tell us what you do at Emmanuel so people can understand what you do there, Michael.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, we're at the beginning of something, I think. We launched a couple of years ago something called the Action Learning Pathway, which was um, I don't know how much people know about ordination training, so I'll say briefly the current kind of standard way that the Church of England has decided to train ordinands is through a degree level qualification. Not everybody will get a full BA. In fact, the vast majority of people get a sort of diploma, which is 2/3 of a BA. With the University of Durham, it's called Common Awards, and that's pretty standard. And that's the sort of principal way that the church chooses to form its leaders and its ordained and lay leaders, actually. And I think what we noticed is there are a whole bunch of people, and this is a phrase anyone from Emmanuel will recognize because I use it a lot. There are a whole bunch of people that we were encountering on the peripheries who are either in the discernment process or were too anxious to come forward into the discernment process, who are saying to us, I really feel God is calling me, but, and that but was lots of things, I'm from the wrong kind of background, I'm the wrong sort of educational standard, I'm the wrong socioeconomic this, that, and the other. But it frequently boiled down to the fact that they were looking in at the kind of structures of formation and training and saying, that is a bit alien to me. I left school at 14, got an apprenticeship. All sorts of things, all sorts of stories that you could repeat, and including, and I mean no disrespect in this really, because I've loved the partnership with the Diocese in the Northwest. I can't speak more highly of the just sense of drive that there is amongst the bishops and directors of ministry that I work with to see change. So I caveat what I'm about to say, but you'd hear conversations and potential ordinand off in the state saying, I really feel God has called me. I've had some leadership in my local church. I've clearly got gifts and skills. I go to see my director of vocations and they give me a book and they say, go away and read this book and come back and maybe write me a page of your thoughts. And two things. It's not true, everyone from estates. It really isn't. But there are lots of people who feel anxious about reading, feel anxious about writing, and they think, well, I don't want to read a book and then write about it and that be the basis of my discernment. And I don't want to go to an institution that's going to make me write essays every 6 weeks or so, thousands and thousands of words. That's just not where I come from. It's not my culture. So we started to work with people to say, okay, how can we form you in a way that's theologically rigorous, but take some of the fear of, if you like, academic performance out of the equation? Because for a lot of people, the last time they were writing essays was school, and for a lot of people, school is not a good experience. It's judgmental, set up to be judgmental, isn't it? Some people get A's, some people get F's. You're set to be measured by your academic ability, and this is about vocation. So the phrase I often use and say to students is, it's not my job to tell God he was wrong in calling you to ministry. It's my job to figure out, how do we form you and prepare you for the ministry to which God has called you? Now, there are all sorts of caveats around that, because you're not entitled to your ministry. There are good reasons why sometimes the church has to say, safeguarding is an obvious one, you can't inhabit the ministry to which God has called you because you're not safe. But I think saying you can't inhabit the ministry to which God has called you because you struggle to write 5,000-word essays is the wrong reason. So the action learning pathway, we designed something that was theologically rigorous. It kept people together in learning spaces, but it gave them opportunities to do kind of reflective learning. If you're familiar with action learning sets, the sort of problem-based learning discussion groups. And we flipped our teaching. We did this for everybody, actually. We flipped the whole teaching process so that it was about, if you like, problem solving. So in biblical studies, it was about making sense of texts. For sermons, for Bible studies. In doctrine, it was about, how do we explain to people who Jesus is? Fully God and fully human might sound fine in a sermon. Sounds a bit weird down the pub. How do we start to problematize theology so that we can start to articulate it and wrestle with it in a way that's contextually appropriate? And we found borrowing from action learning sets was really important. So we designed a pathway for people for whom university qualifications was a barrier, but who clearly had gifts and skills the church needed and can use, and who clearly could articulate a sense of vocation that God had called them. And we're at the beginning of it. There's lots more to do, but it's been a couple of years, and we've got some brilliant folk who have said to us really clearly, we would not have come forward if it wasn't for this. And they are helping us to get this right for the future as well. Don't get me wrong. We designed a curriculum in 3 parts. So there's a kind of contextual placement, theological studies program, and a formation program, which is kind of really practical stuff that we do at weekends. And at the minute, we've really tweaked the theological studies program, so it's much more the action learning, problem-based learning. But we're up for continuing that conversation with students, with people who feel called to figure out what's the best way forward. I know you're advocating for an apprenticeship style model, which is really exciting because it's that keeping people in context, forming people in the place where they'll serve. Really
Yeah.
important, really important.
I think what you've said is really fascinating because it just evokes memories of my own journey through
Yeah,
DDO. That for people who aren't familiar with that, somebody you go and see who decides whether there's something going on there. And I remember the first thing I was asked was what book I'd read
yeah,
most recently, and I said Sue Townsend because I was like, and I was just being honest.
yeah,
That's what I was reading,
yeah,
and it's like, oh no, 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 and immediately that created kind of a them and an us,
yeah,
as though I was trying to be, I needed to get to this, or and speaking to other people, like as you said there, people have given us quite horrific anecdotal evidence of these kind of scenarios, and
yeah,
yeah, and that's at the kind of at the beginning of the process, but also within the process, Michael. I'd be interested to know how you help people here. So I spoke to somebody who's now a priest who was training for ministry. She was a single parent, and she was expected to be at morning prayer at 8:30. It clashed with the same time she had to get a child to school, so
yeah,
there was something that just there was no compromise in that situation.
yeah.
How do you, in your teaching and learning, uh, make that balance for people who are going through similar situations?
Yeah, and we're seeing that increasingly, not just the context of single parent families, but also carers, where the folk have got parents living with them and they need to make sure that they've got their meds, they're ready for the day before they can be out of the house. We've tried to design a curriculum that will flex to meet the needs of the people who are on it. Obviously, we work with dioceses, so the key thing for me, um, I don't mean to sound pious about it, but it is true, is this is about people God has called, right? So God didn't call them and think, oh, blow, I didn't realize you had kids. What was I doing when I called you to ordain ministry? You've got dependents. What was I thinking? There isn't some kind of crisis in the Trinity at this point. So God has called these people knowing what they're bringing and who they're bringing. And this is really important. This is people that we're forming. So there needs to be a degree of flex. I entirely appreciate, I really do, that the church also needs to ensure quality and formation is really happening. So what we all do say around worship is, so when we gather students on a Monday morning, we'll say to them, look, because we recognize that many of you doing school runs and things like that, worship is 9:30. Give you a chance to drop your kids off, get in. There's a bit of breakfast available. So if you're having to miss breakfast because you're running around doing the school run to get to college, there's a bit of breakfast available when you arrive. But we'll meet at 9:30. We kind of build flex like that. I'm not saying we're right about this all the time. We have a really good dialogue with our students. We've got a couple of hundred students at Emmanuel. We've grown really rapidly. Students are not backward and coming forward in the north, as you all know. And I do not mind that at all. For me, that's part of the joy of working with real people. So we keep a really open dialogue. We try to flex as much as we can. We ask them to flex as much as they can, and we meet in the middle somewhere. And that it kind of works, but it is about people. And I think sometimes the sort of sausage factory, these are the expectations you have to fit in, forgets that formation and training is relational deep down. It's about who we are and who we're becoming in Christ as individuals, but who we're becoming collectively. And if collectively there isn't space for the single mom, then collectively there's a problem, right? We can't become the people God is calling us to be if there are folk God is calling and we're saying, well, not you, you don't fit in. So there's a kind of ecclesiological existential crisis going on if the church can't make space for the people God is calling. That's kind of the way I see it.
Yeah, what you say about it's relational. I mean, I think that is through the formation, but it's also in the reality of the ministry that
Yeah,
once you get the dog collar,
yeah,
and I often say to I've people come on placements and whatnot. I quite often say to them, one of the keys to the successes of a successful ministry is the relationships you build around you, whether it's through the congregation in the church or the
yeah,
people outside, etc., etc., etc. But I want to ask you about, some of the people have. I've not had a lot of people push back, but the ones who have perhaps suggested that I'm seeking for academic rigor, to be watered down, to be not robust. Just could you explain how you go around that? I mean,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'll just say this as well, Michael. I have dyslexia, as a lot of other people do. I don't find reading books easy, but I get my learning from the experience, and that's where I get a real joy in learning. Just say a bit about that in the
Yeah.
context of Emmanuel, would you please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at the risk of offending people, I don't mean to, and please hear me. I really do mean this. Sometimes it's a bit of snobbery to use the language of academic rigor. Not always, but it can be. And the reason I say it's snobbery is because it's the presumption that academic rigor, or really, I'm not here to produce academics, I'm here to produce priests. So can we say kind of theological rigor can only be achieved with a university qualification? And I just don't believe it. I've met loads of people with university degrees who do not know how to ask good questions, and frankly do not know how to think. Because if you can't ask good questions, I think you're probably struggling to think clearly, because questions are really important. And yet I've met kids on council estates, in the kind of ministry that I've been involved in the past, the churches I've led, where the most profound theological conversations are happening, that would not be recognized as such, perhaps because they're not referencing the right kind of philosophical or theological debate or the bit of church history. But what they're doing is living and inhabiting real life theological questions. And it's happening in real life right in front of you. And I think that's the stuff that we're supposed to be preparing priests to engage with, deacons, lay readers to engage with, is real people asking real questions, often in contexts of difficulty. Not always, by any means, but often. Um, and degrees can help with that. So what I don't want to do is to say, because this is part of my story, right? I come from a council estate in Liverpool. My family are all kind of Irish immigrant stock, historically. Um, no one with degrees. I was the first to go to university. Um, I don't want to say if you've come from a council estate in the northwest, from an urban context, you can't get a degree. Right? That's nonsense, because I've collected a few over the years, actually. And part of that is because my nana she used to sit me on her knee and taught me to read, this big, and I'm reading book, because she understood something of the world that books opens up for you. And I was one of those kind of nerdy kids that had a library card because we didn't have a telly. We had a coal fire when I was a kid. Like, it was that kind of era I grew up in. And so you go to the library, one, to get warm, and two, to read books, because it was the thing you had that was entertainment. And I know there's loads of people like that, but it's not everyone. And I think there's something about the way we um the way we kind of measure quality that needs to change. And it isn't simply degrees. So what we do at Emmanuel is we ask, when we talk about problem-based learning, we try to make the question the real thing that we're wrestling with. So yeah, okay, the tutors have all got qualifications and degrees from universities. I think that's appropriate. But the kind of questions we're asking are questions that all sorts of people are asking. How do we make sense of this text in a sermon? Is the question whether you're on a degree program or whether you're on a non-degree program, because everyone's got to preach this passage. How do I explain the two natures of Christ? How do I explain forgiveness? How do I explain God's justice? Um, these are things we all care about. And then providing resources in the right sort of way. So we don't just recommend books. We have a lot of digital resources. We have a lot of videos that we've created ourselves, podcasts that we've created ourselves. I have literally sat and recorded myself reading technical theological books, Karl Barth, church dogmatics, so that students can listen to it on a podcast rather than wrestling with it on the text. Because for some, like you say, if you've got dyslexia, it's not that you're unintelligent, it's just that the way you process text is different. So we've also trained our staff. We've got a permanent member of staff, Stephanie Day. She's amazing, who's a support tutor. She just works with students one-on-one, all the day long. She's so passionate. But loads of our staff, we've paid to have them trained as specialist teachers for those with dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia. Actually, trauma-informed teaching, we're developing more of that now, because we recognize that a lot of people bring difficult stories into the classroom. We're trying to invest in staff to say, how can we be as responsive to those whom God is calling as possible? We're not perfect and we've not arrived, but that's the direction of travel.
Yeah, and I'm sure lots of people be attracted to that and inspired by that. But this time's whizzed by, Michael. But a couple of questions I'd like to ask is, firstly, do you think it's right that I call for a national strategy for working class vocations, or you know, do you think there's a good argument for that?
Um, yes. And I think you have been one of those voices. You've made the argument so well, and you've done it in the press, and you've done it in the church. And I know you've garnered support from some really key stakeholders, and you've leveraged that support really well. And it's absolutely right that now we start to take that seriously. There are things I worry about. I'll be honest. I worry a little bit about the sense that um, sometimes when there's a crisis, and there has been a crisis of vocations, that this is the moment when the church starts to think, oh, right, we better look around and see who else can be persuaded into this bonkers way of life that we're all leading. And I think what I've enjoyed about listening to you talk, what I've enjoyed about the paper that you've put forward, and there's others I've talked to about this as well, is the sense in which this is kind of led by recognizing that God is at work in these communities. So this is not about fixing a crisis or saying, we need more cannon fodder for ministry or something like that, which could be a bit cynical, couldn't it? This is about recognizing God has forever been at work in communities that are underrepresented in the leadership of the church. And such folk have gifts and skills and talents that the church is missing out on. And perhaps some of the problem that we're facing institutionally is that we've kind of been fishing from a very, very small pond, if that metaphor works, for a long time. And yet God has been at work across the breadth of our communities and is drawing out and calling up leaders. And some of our bishops in the Northwest, in your diocese, in Blackburn Diocese, have been really vocal about that kind of underground army of women and men that God has been drawing out for years, who've got the cultural capital, the know-how, the connections. The challenge is, how do we form them? I was really intrigued to discover earlier in the year, or early in the academic year, a report from about 1920, where someone had looked into how much it would cost to train working class men for the ministry. And they decided it was too expensive because, as well as teaching them theology, you'd have to teach them some of the cultural mores that they'd need to know. And there's a little footnote somewhere about, etiquette. And thankfully, we've moved on from there. But there is the sort of challenge of, how, because we've trained in one modus for such a long time, it's been degrees. We know what that costs. We know what it looks like. We've got to be really willing to see this as an investment in people and free up the resources to make it work. And that might be financial, but it might be other kinds of resources too. So it's definitely the right time. It's probably over time, to be honest. And thank you for being brave enough to stick your head up and say something about it.
Yeah, I think my driving force really is similar to what you've said, but I just think there's so much untapped potential.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it takes me back to my August days. Is I love nothing more than a Christmas tent walking through the door.
Yeah.
We knew nothing about the capability and potential they had, and then for it to be realised and see some of those people go on and be store managers themselves
Yeah.
was profoundly moving and magical. And
Mhm.
I genuinely think this is where the growth can come from
Mhm.
in these communities from these people. Yeah,
What I love about hearing you say that, and I've heard you say it before, I feel very, very similar about students who pass through Emmanuel and other places I've taught in the past. One of the reasons we started work with students with additional needs, learning differences, particularly like dyslexia, was just watching them realize, man, I might think a bit differently. I might have different processes, but heck, I've got something to bring here. And that sense of blossoming is amazing. And realizing God hasn't just, he's not just tolerating me, he's gifted me in a way that I can't I couldn't imagine before. And
yeah,
people need to have the kind of their imaginations, even for their own lives, expanded, their horizons expanded. The challenge of all of that is it takes time to invest in people, right? You would have had to invest in those temps. We have to invest in the students. And they always take a bit more investment, but I love it. The students who think they can't or they shouldn't. They're
yeah,
my favorites, actually, because then you watch them by the end and they think, I can and I should because I've got gifts, I've got talents. We're not always a time rich church to invest in people. And I think there's something about when I talk about investing a minute ago, recognizing getting people where you want them to be, building their confidence. The pathway we've designed, the action learning pathway, year one, we call it the orientation year. And some of that involves coaching. It just involves coaching people to be able to think of themselves differently, to be able to think of their gifts and talents differently, to be able to see their own potential, because that's not always the case, is it? People walk through the door and they don't know what they're good at. And half your job is to help them to see. So we haven't, our pathway, year one is partly prep, how to do some of the kind of work you need to be able to do as an ordained minister. But a lot of it is coaching and nurturing. And that's about investing in people, which is, I think, what Jesus calls us to, right?
Yeah, and I find that absolutely inspiring, Michael. You know, when I remember when I first turned up in the early days at my theological college, and I'll perhaps not say where it was, but it was very local. You know, my almost my entire skill set that I brought with me and my experiences was encouraged to be put to one side and like, you know, not interested what you've know, what you've learned, you know. And I was like looking back, I was thinking, gosh, that was so wrong, you know. And I say this with great humility, you know, and it seems very surreal that next week I will be presenting this PM, and I'm doing it because I want people to get the opportunities that you're talking about, and more people. And I'm really grateful for what your ministry is leading you to, and the people you're leading to faith. So thanks for that. I just have one final question, Michael, around apprenticeships. Is this a pipe dream of mine and of a few others, or is there at least a pathway of exploration here?
Yeah. I mean, I thank you for what you just said. I think what's really lovely about the TEI sector at the minute, and I'm have a bit of a responsibility in the steering group with all the principals, is this: there are a lot of principals who are hungry to see this change, and there are TEIs, theological education institutions across the country who are thinking into this space. I've got great colleagues in other colleges who are doing similar work to us, and we're trying to learn from each other in that. And I think when you ask, is this a pipe dream? I don't think it's a pipe dream. I don't. If anything, if you're looking for another word, I think it's prophetic. I think it's something about Jesus' own model, being with and alongside those whom he's training up for apostolic ministry. Did the apostles know they were apostles when they were walking around Galilee? I don't think so. Did they know what he was going to do and what he was drawing out of them? Did they know what gifts and talents God had put inside of them? Did they know what he meant when he said to them, "I will make you fishers of men"? I don't think so. Maybe you can allegorize it and spiritualize it, and yeah, but I don't think so. I think they were compelled by Jesus to go with him, and that's the story of many of us, right? I don't know how you felt when you turned up to theological college, but I turned up thinking, what the heck, what have I done with my life? But also having this deep sense of Jesus has called me to this, and that's why I'm doing it,
Yeah.
and the rest will work itself out. And I think if the church can be courageous enough to say, these are people we recognize are called, now let's think about how best to form them. And so, and I say how best to form them because for some people that will be the action learning pathway. For other people, that could be a degree, or it could be a combination of the two. You know, with our ALP, at the end of each year, we have a review to say, hey, look, did you realize if you'd done this as a university piece of work, you'd have passed? You're capable of a degree, you know, because not everyone realizes that they're bright. Or if that's an apprenticeship, having a kind of smorgasbord of pathways and on opportunities for people so they can step towards what God is asking of them is really important, not just because we want to tick some diversity quotient, but because this is what the people of God look like. That's the real joy. Every September, I say to staff and I say to the student body, one of my prayers is, Lord, what are you doing this year with this lot? Because every time a new community, new student body joins, new cohort joins Emmanuel, we become a new community. And half of my task in term one with my colleagues is to figure out who's here, what are their gifts and talents, what are we becoming now that they're here? What are the gifts God has brought us? What are the challenges and the opportunities God has brought us as Emmanuel? So every year the community is formed and shaped because the breadth and diversity of the church is part of God's masterpiece. I don't understand it, but I love it.
Michael, I think we're on the same page here because you know, what I have said again, and what I will say at Synod is that part of educating others is the education of the educator. You know, that
Yeah.
capacity to, and I love that. learning something today that I didn't know yesterday. Where that comes from, I don't give a damn where that comes from, but the joy of that is wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah. Michael, thanks
absolutely.
so much for your time. I know you're a busy
A
guy,
pleasure. Good to talk to you.
and we'll get this out and see if it helps stimulate further discussion. But for now, Michael, thanks for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex.